With us today is a pastor of a church founded in 1892 in Jacksonville, Florida, on a little street called Spruce, Mount Calvary Baptist Church. I couldn't wait to have this conversation with the Reverend John Allen Newman. Thank you for joining us today, Pastor. Most recently, you've been a panelist for a local television station where you get a chance to comment on today's events, both national and local events outside of religion. So let's start off a bit with that. Get your opinion. What is the state of our city, state, and nation?
How much time we have, Fred? Well, let's take them in reverse. Let's take the nation. I think the nation, and thank you for having me on this platform, and to all of those who are joining us and or will be. Thank you for allowing me to spend time with you. Time is something when you spend it, you can't get back. And so I am thankful to invest this time with you and hope you feel the same way. The state of our nation, Fred, I'll tell you, I'm 68 years old. And you're a lot younger than I am.
Indeed, yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I have not ever in my lifetime ever felt our nation in a more divided place. And it really kind of, from a sociological standpoint, it really began to shift as pendulums do in society. It began to shift after President Obama's election. Things that were somewhat under the surface, things that were not publicly displayed or openly publicly vented or ventilated, perhaps, got to the surface. And there was a reaction in 2010. It was under the guise of the Tea Party, but there was racial animus wrapped up in that. There were 7 million guns a year sold up to that point. After President Obama was elected, 17 million guns were sold. There was a shift and sea change in how folks were being racially insensitive. And it ultimately is manifested, of course, in the election and the administration of Donald Trump, where persons were given cover to say the things that they had not said in public and things they felt to express them in public. Laws they wanted to enact with the help of the Supreme Court, eviscerating extremely important portion of the civil rights legislation that was passed, the Voting Rights Act. All of that became a toxic soup. Then when you look at the work that the Koch brothers have done, also through the American Legislative Exchange Council, as you know, ALEC, in using a more grassroots and bottom-up approach to taking everything from city councils to mayoral seats to state legislatures and governorships as they could get them, and then being able to get super majorities. All of this stuff that has come into fore is like a gigantic toxic soup. Then you add, in addition to that, that people went into their silos to the degree that all they wanted was an echo chamber that our media apparatus within the country began to use as their sustainability models what satisfied their customers, not what was the truth, but what was the truth their people wanted to hear. And so then the media became echo chambers. In reality, left and right side of that did that as just a way to stay competitive in the marketplace. And so all of that has just taken us to such a divided place as a nation, where once upon a time, you and I know that folks would have disagreements and we might be political adversaries or political opponents. Now you have to be political enemies, where you've got to destroy. It's a zero-sum game where compromise is the dirty word. All of those things speak to where we are. So we see the rollback of stuff. We see the attack moving to the state. We see the attack on DE&I. We see the attack on wanting to rewrite or at least scrub or redact history, to where Rosa Parks couldn't be written in her narrative that she was asked to give up her seat because she was African American. She was just asked to give up her seat or to sit someplace else, just scrubbing history, because it's all become a part of the same thing, where we're insensitive to the truth. We're only sensitive about the things that we already believe and have conceived to be true. So we're in a really, really terrible place. I mean, there was an opportunity, I believe, with what happened with semantic, take this thing off, and the voting machines were actually not semantic. The other one, Fred, the one that Fox just got beat about, it wasn't semantic. Semantic's the one they're up against now. The $787 million lawsuit that Fox had to pay in order to make it go away. There was an opportunity. Dominion. They were able to, if that had gone to trial, they were able to then put out in the public all the lies that were told on Fox News that they had to stipulate were lies. But because they settled it, and because there was no, I guess, arrangement to disclose what was in the settlement, those things never came out. So Fox News has continued to do the same thing they've done before, talk to their echo chamber, keep their audience in play. And they clearly did not want the truth to be told because they were afraid they were going to lose their audience. Again, the sustainability model. So in the state, we see all these things happening as a result of what actually began in 2008 with President Obama being elected, and then culminating in the administration of Trump. And now we see what DeSantis is doing. It's pretty egregious in the state. It really is. And I happen to teach DE&I for Howard University School of Business. And so I know what it is. And when I've talked to people and audiences about it, they understand that it's not exactly what folks think it is. So all these things are a bucket, DNI, CRT. All these things are a bucket people throw stuff in, and they don't know what it is. All they know is they don't like it. So all you have in the background is OAN, Fox, Newsmax playing in the back, and all you hear is that. And they're all saying basically the same things in the echo chamber. Persons don't do a deep dive, and if they did on those news organizations, they wouldn't get the truth anyway, but they believe it to be true. And, the basic misconception about DE&I is simply that we're not saying, as they have portrayed, that people have been to the table now, you've got to give up your seat, but people who have not had a chance to sit at the table so they can sit at the table. That's not DE&I. Diversity, equity, and inclusion cannot be exclusion. It's oxymoronic. It means that you build a bigger table so you have more seats. So everybody has a seat at the table, as opposed to you thinking you got to give your seat up. Again, it's disinformation. City-wise, I think that our election proved, with the election of Donna Deegan, that Jacksonville said, we're sick of the division. And hopefully, we can be a new template for how things should be done in this state, with Jacksonville actually leading the way. So I'm excited about that, but I think that's where we are.
There are many folks who are on the other side of the aisle these days. In fact, a lot of African Americans are on the other side of the aisle. If we look back 30, 40, 60 years, we didn't hear as much about it because, of course, many of them started out as Republicans because Lincoln was a Republican. But then times changed. Come 65, after the Civil Rights Acts were passed, many and here in the South, many blacks were a part of joined the Democrat Party, and many whites began to leave the Democratic Party and go to the Republican Party. But now we see almost a reversal of that, as we see many blacks carrying Black for Trump signs, and they're on the other side of the aisle from us. And we have we'll talk about it in a minute, but we have a senator that's even elected as a Republican to the United States Senate. And many blacks feel that they don't need the help of the government, as some of their compatriots feel. They can make it on their own without that self-help and without government interference. How have you maneuvered and with those who are on the other side of the aisle, quote unquote?
No, actually, I've talked with quite a few of them, and I have some who were in the Trump administration who I've still stayed in touch with, they're not, how can I put it, they're in different kind of spaces. If there is one common denominator, I think what it is for them, and yes, there are those who are living in denial, as you are saying, as if racism no longer exists. There is no such thing as systemic racism. Yeah, there are definitely African Americans in that space. Tim Scott is one of them, who's running for president right now on the Republican side.
You know, I like him, but I had a conversation with one of his constituents who who's a conservative, and I'm presuming he's a Republican for the most part. He lives on a mountaintop in Carolina, but he told me he wasn't going to vote for Tim because Tim supported a Democrat senator on some legislation, and that kind of nullified any thoughts he was going to have to go for him. What are your thoughts about Tim Scott?
Well, you know, Tim was on The View a couple of days ago, and he got into it with Sonny Hostin about systemic racism. And I think that some of the ones who I've stayed in touch with, their space is this, that it's very easy to put African Americans in a place where we're kind of monolithic and we all think the same way. They are saying that there's got to be space for differentiation of thought, even within the African American community, which I agree with. And I think that in their own mind, what their feelings, and if those feelings are pretty strong, that we have the capability to do anything if we have the right opportunity. We have the capability to excel and exceed what the expectations are if we have the opportunity. I think their thing is, when the narrative is written, or the narrative seems to be, that African Americans can only exceed if the government gives them money or gives them a handout, which they think is demeaning. Whereas, you know, those of us on the more progressive side or the center left side say, no, it's just that everyone, because the playing field is not level, that these things help to level that playing field. I mean, honestly, look at Senator Rick Scott. Rick Scott, yeah, he's a multimillionaire now, but he grew up on public assistance. Right. And so do you discount that? Do you rip that from your personal narrative? I mean, had you not had that public assistance, which you are now kind of against, where would your life have been? So there's some hypocrisy there too. So I do, yeah, there is a conservative movement within the African American space, but some of that also is in the strong belief, and there's some merit to this. I don't know how you would say it, but I think you probably would agree with me, that in many instances, they feel the Democratic Party has paid lip service to a lot of things, have not come through on those things, and have taken the African American vote for granted and don't think they have to work for it. That's another thing I think that drives African American conservatism.
Being the case, what do you view is the state of religion today, given all that's going on? What's the state of religion?
Well, you know, Fred, I think that in some ways, faith has gone through a kind of metamorphosis through COVID, post-COVID experience. There's been an absolute shift in what has happened in the church. Persons who were regular attendees, who could not come for health reasons, got used to being a part of the cyber congregation. And when churches opened back up, church buildings opened back up, they kind of felt comfortable watching from their couch or from their dining room or their living room or their bedroom, watching worship and feeling part of the experience. So it's not nearly the same as being in person that it is to be virtual. And so that really is where the church is today across many denominational lines. That I talk to my friends who are Church of God in Christ, who are AME, in the African American experience, Baptist, Pentecostal. I mean, across the board, the numbers of congregants showing up on Sunday are not the same. Many who had 3 services now have 1 service, and those aren't filled like they used to be. Now, there are exceptions to the norm, But the new normal is that there's been an absolute change in attendance in the church. Going to the broader perspective of our broader conversation, I think the church has failed the community. And I'm not talking about the Black church and the Black community, I'm talking about the community universal. I think the church, particularly the white evangelical church, embraced white nationalism in the instances, embraced the America first kind of mindset. That kind of, country first, give me back even to Adolf Hitler, and other strong persons who say, we've got to be first. And we say, and I'm getting into this, we see the results of that thinking and what's happening with China over the world, got it to kind of go away. Anyway, that's another story for another time. We can come back about that. But my concern is that the church, from a social and political space, has tolerated certain things that the scriptures are clearly against. I mean, the Jesus that wing of the church represents, I don't know who that is, because Christ clearly says, here are the ones I'm concerned about. He said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor and to set the captives free, to, proclaim that this is the Lord's favor. He talks about those who are oppressed, the least of these. He talks about clearly, in as much as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. And sadly, the church seems to have an issue unless they can define who the least is. So the least may be those who are, victims of abuse. Okay, fine. But the least cannot be the LGBTQ community. No, we got to take hands off on that. But here's what's interesting, Brett, and I talked this to my folks last night. Isn't it interesting that in Genesis it talks about the heavens and earth, and the concept of that time was the firmament was actually glass ceiling with holes in it, and the water would come down through the waters above, and that's. Well, guess what? That's what they knew at the time. That's what they understood at the time, right? So their understanding of creation was limited with information they had access to. Nobody today in the most conservative church would say that that's true, because they know it's not. They know that, we have National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we've got satellites, we've got meteorological satellites, so we know how weather is. They didn't know that. Whereas that same person would say, yeah, we know that we have better information now than what they understood in Genesis. We also have better information about human sexuality now they had then. And yet there's a divide. We don't want a conversation. What's that new information say? I want to have a conversation about the interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, which is the part of the brain that deals with sexual identity. I want to have a conversation about that. But we have better information now. So maybe what we need to do is have a little more compassion about things we now know we didn't know before. So to me, the church in many ways has failed the culture, in that the church stands in many ways as a beacon of hatred and disapproval rather than love. And Jesus said, they'll know you're my disciples by how you love one another, not by holding up a sign saying God hates fags. And so we really have to, I think, get to a better place as the church of Jesus Christ to represent who God really is, and above our pay grade to decide who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. I think we may be surprised at who ends up in both.
Why did you seek to get a doctorate degree? What was your motivation for doing that after all this time that you spent in the pulpit and giving the word?
When I went to do my defense, they asked me, one of the questions in my defense towards the end, if you had to do this over, what would you do different? I said, I'd do it in my 20s, not my 60s. But I really felt, and my wife was a real catalyst in this. I mean, I really owe her getting behind me and saying, you know what, and I don't mean this to be it's so against type. I don't mean this to be self-serving, but she said, everyone who I've met in your life talk about that you're brilliant and you need to document that. And you need to act. I had a degree that was conferred upon me from a school in Virginia, but that was not a terminal degree. That was an honorary degree. But she said, you really need to do the work and confirm what others see in you. And, I took it to heart and I did it. It was 3 years and I did it during COVID. And my last semester was maybe we were in person. I went to an AME school in Wilberforce, Ohio, called Payne Seminary, and I just graduated back in May. So I did it just as a way of giving documentation to what others had seen in me that I need to see in myself, and I credit my wife to a great degree, and to my congregation who was patient with me and loved me and supported me through it.
Are you seeing people turning more to religion? Are they turning inside and turning to themselves? Are they turning more inward, or are they turning to God? What's going on?
I think, Fred, that your question is poignant in that, once again, COVID kind of moved people inward. And here's what I shared with my congregation. I guess it was Sunday. It's kind of syllogistic. It's kind of one upon the conclusion. But people became really familiar with death like they never had before, particularly young people. When you and I were youngsters, we didn't think about dying. Dying or death wasn't on our minds unless somebody we knew who was generally usually older passed away. Or it was some freak accident and someone killed, like in a car accident or something. But COVID brought death close. Young people saw their friends get sick and some of them die. Or now the long haul COVID cases in which their friends recover, but they're not the same. The mental fog or other things. Some have to be on oxygen the rest of their lives because of what COVID did to their lungs. So they began to make a conclusion, draw a conclusion, or at least ask questions for which they drew a conclusion. What's important to my life now that I realize my life could be over? Because they've seen it, they saw it. And they began, and others began to evaluate what's important to me, what brings me value to my life. And some of them decided the church no longer brought value. And the church didn't bring value, perhaps because they weren't addressing their needs and concerns. Or maybe congregations saying, we know that, they're saying we shouldn't come to worship, but come on anyway and prove God that you love him and you're not operating in fear. That was about finances in many instances. Churches not knowing how they're going to survive if folk are not in the pews. People saw through that. In addition to that, Fred, there are people who watch night of the year before COVID hit were probably telling their congregations all the things that God was going to do in their lives next year. And the Lord told them this and the Lord told them that. And then COVID hit. And yet people saying, well, I thought God told you that all these great things were going to be happening this year. God didn't tell you that thousands of people per month were going to be dying. And so they began, well, what else did my pastor not tell me the truth about? What else did my pastor miss that he said God told him? People aren't stupid, man. And so people, yes, they did go inward. They did become distrusting, not only of institutions, but they also became distrusting of the church for not telling people, in all instances, the truth that they needed to know. Ooh. And so, people talking about having faith and praying, and yet they did pray. People still died. So, people have to be helped, not hyped. And COVID made it really, really critical for understanding the value of life, what it means to protect your life, and what you decide is important to you. Some folk decided the church is no longer important to them. And so what we have to do is have a relevant message that meets people where they are, and that involves dealing with crime, dealing with health, dealing with access to opportunity, all those things the church has to advocate for. And so I know there are congregations that did do those things through COVID, and they benefit because their congregations are pretty much still strong and intact. The attendance isn't the same, but the commitment from their people is relatively the same. So I would just say that I think in many instances, people did go inward. Some of them did kind of discount the church because they felt the church had lost some of its relevancy. And so we have to have a message that brings them back. And the whole gospel, not the prosperity nonsense, but the whole gospel of God meeting people where they are, in their pain, in their darkness, in their depression, in their struggles, and that's where grace lives, and the grace of God can sustain us. But assuming things aren't going to happen, it just simply isn't true.
Meeting people where they are. I like that. To be continued. Thank you for joining us today, Pastor John Allen Newman of Mount Calvary Baptist Church, Jacksonville.
And thank you for your patience in getting me to this platform. I enjoyed it, friend. Thank you. Anytime.